And what had been discussed is that he was a picture of the false Messiah that is to come, and he is a personification of Hasatan. The Scriptures have many of these pictures of the false Messiah, this arch rival of the Messiah, this false impersonator of the Messiah, who will rise up in the last days to destroy the people. Likewise, Haman. It was in his heart, his intentions, to destroy Mordecai, who typifies Yeshua, but he seeks not only to destroy Mordecai, but the entire Jewish people. The entire book of Esther. It's one of the most marvelous of books because it lays out this picture so plainly, and it does it in an overlay with the Messiah. As we'll see, the dates that we'll look at, they all play a very significant role. Also in our last session, we had looked at some of the other pictures of the false Messiah in the Scripture. We haven't really dealt with Pharaoh, which we'll probably deal with a little bit in this session. We did deal with Absalom, and we mentioned Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the Greek villain at the time of the Maccabees. And then we came up into the modern times and Adolf Hitler and so forth. All of these are going to be repeating more or less the same path, the same pattern, as it says in Kohelet, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. And where we had left off, we were dealing with the element of pride. And we had made this statement that pride was the original sin. That Hasatan, that Lucifer, the Satan, the adversary, that he had been lifted up in pride directed towards himself. There's nothing wrong with pride as long as pride is directed towards God, towards the Creator, the one that we are to worship. There are 13 points to Jewish worship. And one of those points are the Jewish faith, rather, the 13 principles of the faith. One of those points is that you may not worship anyone other than God. And so we see that Hasatan in Ezekiel chapter 28 had turned his, 28 and 29, had turned his worship towards himself. And he had been lifted up in his own pride. We saw in the picture of Avshalom that Avshalom was beautiful and that he was very vain. He was very in the eyes of the people exactly what they would want. He had a beautiful covering of hair, but this vanity was his undoing. Now, on pride, we're going to see in this session another major picture of the false Messiah. So let's go to the book of Job. Let me mention that Job is from the time of Moshe, the time of Moses. He's listed in the book of Genesis as having come into Egypt with Yaakov, with Jacob. He is the son of Issachar, and so he is a contemporary, a peer of the grandfather of Moshe, or Moses, who was Kohat, the tribe of Levi. Now they are living in the land of Uz, which we are told the land of Uz in the book of Lamentations is in the land of Edom, descended from Esau. And you might have noticed that Eliphaz the Temanite, the man Teman, was a son of Esau. Eliphaz was a son of Esau. These are family names in this land. Now we see in Job chapter 41, which, by the way, the book of Job is very eschatological. It's very full of pictures of the coming of the Messiah and the redemption and the battle that takes place in the time that is called the time of trouble, or the birth pains of the Messiah. We meet Leviathan. It says, chapter 41, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Now notice, we're talking about a character. We're not talking about an animal here. It says, will he speak softly to you? It'll go on, and it'll tell us in the very next verse, will he make a covenant with you? Will he make a covenant with you? Now I'd like you to hold your hand here in the book of Job and go to the book of Daniel in chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, we meet the false Messiah. This is a very famous prophecy called the prophecy of the 77s, a prophecy that covers 490 years a prophecy dealing with the Jewish people in the city of Jerusalem. It starts in verse 24. 77s are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Drop down to verse 27. It's speaking about the false Messiah, who is the prince who is to come of the people that would destroy the temple, or destroy the holy city and the temple. That was destroyed by the Romans. In chapter 9, verse 27, it says, then he shall confirm a covenant with many. That would be with many Jews for 1 week or for 7 years. But in the middle of the week, in the middle of the 7 years, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. On the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So we see Leviathan, which is called the twisted serpent. Leviathan, the twisted serpent, is going to make a covenant with the people. Now, according to Encyclopedia Judaica, and I have the article on Leviathan, this is in volume 11, and I'm reading on page 89 and 90. So if you'd like to put this into your notes, it tells us that Leviathan is in the Bible and Talmudic literature. The Leviathan denotes various marine animals, some real, others legendary, and others again both real and legendary. The word Leviathan seems to derive from the root levi, to coil or to turn, to twist, which is a further confirmation of its serpentine form. In the Bible, it is used interchangeably with several other sea monsters. The Tanin, which is described for you in Ezekiel chapter 29 and 32 as being the dragon in the midst of the river. In that chapter, it's talking about Pharaoh. Remember that Pharaoh is a picture of the false Messiah. Rahab, which is a term for Egypt. You find Rahab Him Shabbat in the book of Isaiah. Rahab, who sits idle. It's talking about Egypt. And Yam, which is the word for sea. Like, for instance, the Red Sea. Actually, it's called the Reed Sea. Yam Suf. Now, we're told as we read down here a very interesting thing. I'm going to drop down to I'll spot it here. It says, in the Hittites knew it as a struggle between the dragon Illucanus and the mortal Hupasius. In Mesopotamia, it appears in several forms, of which the most famous is the Battle of Marduk in Tiamat in the creation epic. More relevant is a cylinder seal from Tel Ashmor of the 24th century BCE, which pictures two men fighting a seven-headed serpent. Now that's very interesting. From this, we find in the Middle East that not only the Jews, but all of the Middle Eastern peoples had a character called Leviathan, and it was understood to be a seven-headed beast. Now, we have to read the Scriptures as though we are in that time. We can't read it as though we're in the United States in the 1990s, but rather in the time that the Scriptures were given. So, taking that into account, let's go to the book of Revelation, and we see a seven-headed beast here. Revelation in chapter 13, which tells us that I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. Now remember that the word sea in Hebrew is yam, which we're told is synonymous with Leviathan, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and his horns 10 crowns, on his heads a blasphemous name. Now if you were Yochanan, if you were John, and you were standing there and you saw this vision, immediately what you would say is, this is Leviathan. But you have been taught, I'm sure, in your Bible studies that this is the false Messiah, the Antichrist in his kingdom. So we see a parallel here. Now let's go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 27. The Bible has a tremendous amount of passages that tell us about the Leviathan. It says, in that day the Lord, verse 1, in that day the Lord with a severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, that twisted or that coiled serpent, and he will slay the reptile, the Tanin, in the sea. Now let's go to chapter 51, of Isaiah, verse 9. And in this verse we're told, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord." Now when you see the term awake, awake, to the Jewish mind this means the day called Yom Torah, the day of the awakening blast, which most Christians would call the Feast of Trumpets. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm or Zeroah of the Lord. We're told in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 1, "Who has believed our report, and to whom has the Zeroah, the arm of the Lord, been revealed?" It's speaking about the Messiah. At the Passover meal, you have a Seder. This is the name of the meal. You have a special plate called the Seder plate. You have a shank bone placed on the plate to represent the lamb that was slain in the temple. That shank bone is called the Zeroah, the arm. It is a picture of the Messiah as well as being a picture of the lamb that was slain. You see, everything just flows right into the next to show us the Messiah. It's many, many pictures all through the Scriptures. Now, chapter 51, verse 9, "Awake, awake, put on strength, O Zeroah Adonai." So we see it's Rosh Hashanah. It is the Feast of Trumpets. We see the Messiah, "O arm of the Lord." Awake as in the ancient days, in the generations of old. Are you not the arm that cut Rahab apart and wounded the serpent and wounded the Tanin? Now let's go to the Psalms. We're going to go to Psalm 74. And in Psalm 74, let's go to verse 13 and 14. It's talking about God. It says, "You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters." Now notice, the heads of the sea Tanin, the serpents in the waters. You broke the heads, plural, of Leviathan in pieces and gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Now it's talking about when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. But it is also talking about the future when the Messiah comes. It's talking about the false Messiah. In the past it was talking about Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a picture of the false Messiah. Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture of the false Messiah. Avshalom is a picture of the false Messiah. Haman, our villain, is a picture of the Messiah, the false Messiah. So back to Job chapter 41, it says, "Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens?" Verse 6, this is a key verse. "Will your companions make a banquet of him?" Part of the Jewish eschatology that we learn about in the festivals is called the Feast of Leviathan. It is part of the festival Sukkot, or Tabernacles. There are two feasts at the festivals of Sukkot, or Tabernacles. One is the wedding supper. And we read about that blessed are they that are called to the wedding supper of the Lamb. The bride has made herself ready. You see, the wedding supper by most people has been pictured as taking place in heaven at the time of the wedding, but that is not the customs of a Jewish wedding. In a Jewish wedding, you have the kiddushin, you have the wedding where the bride and the groom are under the chuppah, the marriage canopy, and then they go into a 7-day honeymoon called the 7 days of the chuppah. At the end of the 7 days, they come out of the chuppah, they come out of the marriage chamber, the chadar, and then they go back to the father's house of the groom, or they go back to the bride's house, to her parents' house, and there is a marriage supper that is held there. This is what we read about in Luke chapter 12, where Yeshua says that when he returns from the wedding, that he will come to the servants that are waiting for him, those that have become believers during the 7 years of the time of the birth pains, that he will come and gird himself and he will serve them, for them to watch and to wait for him. Now, what is the Feast of Leviathan? We've identified Leviathan as being the false Messiah. But here, the false Messiah, we're told also of another feast in the book of Revelation, chapter 19. It's where all the birds and the animals are called to feast upon the carcasses of those that have rejected the Messiah of God, the salvation of God, the redemption of God. That when Messiah comes, it is a day of judgment, and they are judged, they are slain, and the birds and the animals are going to feast on them. So everyone is invited to a banquet. The banquet of the righteous is the wedding supper. The banquet of the unrighteous is to be the food that will supply for the birds and the animals and all the beasts of the field. Now, continuing on in Job chapter 41, we're told in verse 34, it says, He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. So we come back to this element of pride. You see, the spirit of the false Messiah is loose in the world. And pride is one of the most damaging things to the believers. We're often sucked into pride. It is the root of the evil that Haman worked from. It is the root of the evil that Antiochus Epiphanes worked from. They sought to be worshipped. They sought to be idolized. What caused Haman to have his great hatred initially for Mordecai? Haman sought to have Mordecai to bow down and worship him. What does Hasatan do with Yeshua? He tells Yeshua, if you will bow down and worship me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. Hasatan would have you to direct your pride away from God towards yourself and ultimately towards him. So let's follow this out a little bit more. We have Leviathan, the seven-headed beast. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Let's go back to the book of Job, chapter 9, Eov 9, verse 13. It says, God will not withdraw his anger. The allies of the proud lie prostrate beneath him. Now the word here for proud is Rahab. And if you'll remember that Rahab is a synonym for Leviathan according to the Encyclopedia Judaica. Let's go to Job chapter 26. In Job chapter 26, it tells us that verse 9, it's talking about God. It says he covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters. At the boundary of light and darkness, the pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He stirs up the sea with his power. Remember the sea in Hebrew? Yam. It's a synonym for Leviathan. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. By his spirit he adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Now, in this passage, there is another term for Rahab, which means proud. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. The word for storm here is going to be the Hebrew word Rahab, which is a synonym for the proud. Now notice something. In the scriptures, you have the sea, which is the habitation of Leviathan. You're told in Genesis chapter 1 that Leviathan dwells in the midst of the sea. We saw this in Psalm 74. We saw this in Revelation chapter 13. We see it here in Job chapter 26. We're told in the very first passage, in fact, this is one of the first references in the Jewish writings to the Messiah. It's one that is worthy of knowing. Bereshit, Genesis 1, Bereshit means in the beginning. The Bible starts off with Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim v'haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Job chapter 1, verse 2, it says, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now in the Midrash, which is the Jewish interpretations of the Scriptures, it says the Spirit of Messiah was hovering gently over the face of the waters. Now the waters are seen as being the enemy of the people. There are two types of waters in the Scripture. A type of water that is called Mayim Chayim, living water, which Yeshua spoke of, that if you believe in him, that out of your belly would flow rivers of Mayim Chayim, living water. Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3, it says, with joy we shall draw Mayim, waters, from the wells of salvation. That's speaking of the Mayim Hayim. But when you talk about the sea, the ocean, the sea, it is seen as an obstacle to the people. Many times we have rivers that are coming, and they are barriers to the people from going towards God. Now, for instance, we had when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and they were leaving the idolatry behind, there was something in the way to stop them. There was something there to stop them. What was it? It was the Yam Suf. It was the Reed Sea. And Moshe stood on the bank of the sea, and he says, stand back and see the Yeshua, the salvation of the Lord. And God sent the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and his Ruach parted the sea, made paths through it, as it says in Psalm 136. And the people crossed the sea. By tradition, the Jews believed that there were 12 paths made across the sea, one for each of the tribes. Remember that Yeshua, in the fourth watch of the night, that he walked on the midst of the sea. He had dominion over it. We see that when he was in the boat and that the boat was being tossed to and fro, that Yeshua rose up and he said, Shalom, peace, be still, and that he had dominion over the sea. So there are many, many pictures of the Messiah and his dominion, but we see a very clear emerging picture of the false Messiah as we look at the book of Esther, and we see the pride that is motivating Haman. He is a man that is consumed in pride. People often ask me about politics. People ask me in politics about, well, what I believe about this one or what I believe about that one. What is my opinion? One of the things that I look for is I listen for the words of Avshalom. Remember Avshalom that went down to the gate? And he told the people everything they wanted to hear. And so I try to listen and say, is this man just telling people what they want to hear? Or is he doing what the people, is he in his heart sincere? And is this man caught in pride? Because if he is caught in pride, then I have a picture of the false Messiah before me. I have one that God tells me to turn away from. Now let's go back to the book of Esther. I'm fascinated as we study about the false Messiah because there are so many pictures and the Bible has so much to tell us about them. But I am fascinated not only by the character of the false Messiah, but I am fascinated by how he is defeated, how he is destroyed utterly by God. You see, as you see the strength and the power of this enemy, and indeed, the ones that have gone forth in the power of Hasatan have been powerful. They have been strengthened, but every one of them has fallen in their day. And in this, the passage from the Proverbs that we read about how he that digs a pit to fall into it. And each one of them, whether it's Haman or whatever, their fall is great. Now, very significantly, in this chapter, Haman, even before he goes to King Achashverosh, has determined in his heart to destroy all the Jewish people, and he has cast the lots to pick a month to do it. The month that has been chosen is the month of Adar. What he will do is that they are going to cast the lots in the month of Nissan. Now, last session I told you to write that down, Nissan, and the day that they cast the lots on to select the day to destroy the Jews will be the 13th day of Nissan. So you need to have that in your notes and make sure that's in the forefront of your mind as we move forward in this session. The 13th of Nissan. Now that is the day before Passover. It doesn't tell you this. It never mentions it. It assumes that you know this point. Now what has happened in this chapter is that Haman has come and requested permission to destroy the Jews. He has said that the Jews are rebellious against the king, that they have been a rebellious people from their beginning. And he offers to pay 10,000 talents of silver into the treasures of the king. And the king says, take them and do as you please. And so the lots are cast, and it is decreed that the Jews will be attacked. They will be attacked. Now at this point, all the people in the kingdom would attack the Jewish people. All of them would attack the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are doomed. There is no hope. There is no way out. They are doomed, and it has been made by the act of the king of Persia. And we learned this in our last session, that once the king of Persia has made a decree, it may not be altered. It may not be changed. Now we talked about Achashverosh. The king of Persia is a picture of God, and how that God has made a law This law says that he who sins must die. There is no other way out of it. He who sins must die. The penalty for sin is death. The penalty for sin is death. And then what is worse, all of us has sinned, for all have come short of the glory of God. We have all departed from him. We have all transgressed. We have all moved away. So we, just like the Jews back so many years ago, are faced with an impossible situation. There is no way out. I'd like to point out that the word Hasatan means the adversary. If you go to Israel today and you go to court and you are accusing someone, you will be called Hasatan, the Satan, the accuser. Notice that Haman in the passage, he comes in and he accuses the Jewish people. This is found in verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples. How many times have you heard this? The Jewish people today, it's said that they are different. Why do they have to be different from everyone else? They are different. It says, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. You know what the 10,000 talents of silver remind me of? I mentioned this in the last session. Adolf Hitler, when he's so desperately needing trains to move his troops and his equipment to the front, where the advancing enemy was coming into Germany, chose to destroy the Hungarian Jews as his top priority. See, Haman was willing to pay a great price, an enormous price, in order to see his enemies destroyed. Let's move on into chapter 4. In chapter 4, when Mordecai learned all that happened, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the square in front of all the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hatak, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hatak went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasures to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hatak returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a command from Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yes, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to return this answer to Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days. Night or day, my maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Then Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. There are a number of things that we can draw from this passage. The first thing that I see is that Mordecai, as soon as the decree was issued, Mordecai immediately responded. Mordecai tore his clothes. Mordecai put on ashes and sackcloth. Mordecai went about weeping and lamenting and mourning. Mordecai was in fasting. Not only him, but throughout the kingdom, the Jewish people responded immediately. One of our tendencies is that we will not respond immediately. Here it would be almost 12 months before the Jewish people were to be attacked, to be destroyed. And we have this tendency in our own mind to think that's a distance away. And we will not move immediately. One of my favorite passages is found in the book of Ezra, chapter 8, if you'll turn there. In Ezra chapter 8, we see that the Jewish people were returning at the time of Ezra back to the land of Judea, back to the province of Judea, one of the Persian provinces, and they were going to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, actually to rebuild the temple. Now, the problem was that there were not many of them to make the journey. A second problem was that the way was long and it was dangerous. There were many robbers along the way. Now, Ezra had boasted about how great and powerful his God was. And so when it came time to go, there was a problem, because he was ashamed, he was embarrassed. He felt like, I've said our God is so powerful, so strong. He was embarrassed to go and to ask the king for an escort. But yet you could not venture out into this territory unless you had some protection. So in chapter 8, verse 21, this is what it says. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him the right way for us and our little ones and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to request of the king an escort of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the road, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all those for good who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and entreated our God for this, and he answered our prayer. So we see that Mordecai responded immediately, along with the Jewish people, that when the decree was issued, immediately they started coming before God. Mordecai goes to the gate, and because he can't enter in the gate in the clothing of mourning, Esther sends the clothes down to him and requests him to tell her what is the problem. And when he tells her everything, then note this. This is particularly interesting. It says in verse 8, he also gave him a copy of the written decree of their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go in to the king to make supplication to him and to plead before him for her people. Note that Mordecai is commanding Esther, who is the queen, to go in before the king, even though it is at great risk to her life. Now we see her submitting to Mordecai. We see her submitting to Mordecai. In our generation, in our culture, we seem to have a problem with submission. We're told that rebellion is the sin of witchcraft. We have this attitude that whenever I reach adulthood, no one can tell me what to do anymore. I learned this a long time ago, and this was one of the most valuable lessons that I learned in my life. I learned that God said to honor your mother and your father, and that this goes without a limit to time. It makes no difference if you live to 100 and your parents are 150. You are to honor your mother and your father. I remember that a number of years ago that I had some things that I felt compelled by God to wear a kippah. Now most of you know, and if you don't, you need to know this, that I'm not Jewish, that I am what is called a God-fearer, one that we see like Cornelius in the Scriptures. I have joined myself to the Jewish people, but I am not Jewish. And I have no problem with that. I am very content with what God made me. So people come to me and say, well, if you're not Jewish, why do you wear a kippah or a yarmulke, the little cap that's worn on the head of the Jewish people? That cap does not signify that one is Jewish. That cap, if you go to a synagogue, no matter whether you're a Jew or non-Jew, you will be requested to wear a kippah. If you go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the wall where the people go to pray, every man will put a kippah on to go down to the wall. And so, at any rate, the kippah is simply, it signifies that God is your covering. Now, why do I wear a kippah? Well, that's one reason. I wear a kippah whenever I stand to minister or to teach, because I believe that 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where it's talking about a man should pray with his head uncovered, is not talking about a hat or something placed on the head, but rather is talking about hair worn after a certain fashion, that of the temple prostitutes that they had in the region of Greece and Corinth. So I believe that the passage has been misunderstood. I wear a kippah because I believe that the Scripture teaches us the opposite, that we are to have something on our head showing our submission and our covering before God. I also wear the kippah because I believe that as a non-Jew and one that believes that Yeshua is the Messiah and one that has joined himself to the Jewish people, part of my role, part of the works that I am to do is to fight against anti-Semitism. Is to fight against anti-Semitism, to make a stand saying, I stand with the Jewish people. I stand with the Jewish people because God has placed his name upon them and God has instructed us to stand with them. Now, therefore, whenever I wear a kippah, I am not trying to make anyone believe that I'm Jewish. I am simply making that statement. I stand with the Jewish people and I stand against anti-Semitism. Very unique thing is whenever I wear a kippah, I have no problem finding people that are anti-Semitic. They generally are able to make themselves known, and then it can be dealt with. Now, my father I led to the Lord when he was 72 years old, and he and I were tremendously close, and I just when I became a believer, God made that bond even closer. Well, I went to my father because I knew my father's not going to understand, why is my son wearing this? What is he trying to say? So first, I went to the rabbi that is in our community. I went to him, and I had the kippah in my pocket, and I had a meeting with him, and I went in and said, I want to tell you why I wear a kippah. And, you know, I want you to understand. I want you to understand that what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. And so I laid it out before him. He said, please put it on. This is great. He said, put it on. It's very similar to during the Holocaust in Germany. I believe it was the king of Denmark, it was either Denmark or Finland, that when the Germans came into the country, the Germans made a law that all the Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David on their clothing. It identified them as Jews so that the people could spit on them and beat them and abuse them, and that they could be persecuted. Well, the king, I think it's Denmark, but I need to check that. I know it's just slipped my mind right now. When he came out on his balcony the next day, he had a yellow Star of David on his clothing. And he asked all of the people of his land, all of them, the non-Jews, every one of them, to put a yellow Star of David on their clothing. What it would be if all of the non-Jewish believers would take and say to the Jewish people, we stand with you. We stand with you, not with the motive of winning them to Yeshua, but with the motive of we stand with you because God has said for us to stand with you. And in our hearts, in our prayers, in our ways, we will support you. And we will stand against anti-Semitism. So after I went to the rabbi, I put my kippah in my pocket, and I drove up to where my father lives. It's a several-hour trip, and I drove up and came in, and we had a meal. And following the meal, I told him that I wanted to talk to him, that I had something very serious that I needed to talk to him about. And so I took the kippah out, I showed it to him and explained what it was and talked with him about it. And I said, listen, in all ways, I want to submit myself to you. I want you to know that I respect you and I respect your opinions and what you say, and I believe that God has instructed me to do this, but He's also instructed me to honor you. So I'm asking your permission in doing this, and I'm asking you if you will support me in doing it. And my father said, well, of course. But you see, this is something that I think is tremendously important. We see in Esther. She is the queen. She is the queen of the land, but yet Mordecai can make a request of her. And I encourage you that whoever you are, however old you are, no matter what you think of your parents, that you honor your parents. You honor your elders, that you stand by them, you support them. Now, in this passage, as we go on, we see that Mordecai is going to lay the situation out before Esther, and he's going to tell her that it's very grave and that she is the only one that is in a position to do something. However, he makes the statement that if you fail, or if you refuse to do this, God will raise up our deliverance from somewhere else. And we see in Mordecai this faith in God. Even though God is not mentioned, it is an underlying thing. And by the way, before we finish this session, we will talk about that the name of God, the name of the Lord, is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but yet it is. It is hidden in the passages, and we'll show that to you. So be sure to catch that as we get to it. Now she makes the statement that no one can go into the king, and that this is a law of the Persians, that there is one law, and that this is the law of death. We read in the book of Josephus that the Persian king, Xerxes, and the kings that followed after him, that they had 12 axemen that were around the throne. Anyone that would approach the throne uninvited by the king would be axed to death. But we see something very significant here. The king has a scepter. The king has a golden scepter, and if the scepter is extended out, then it is a free gift of life. It is equivalent to grace. That God has said that you have sinned, the penalty for sin is death. You must die, but God has made a way. God has provided a scepter. God has provided a way that you can have life extended to you, even though when the law requires you to die. That scepter in Hebrew is the shevet, word for scepter. That scepter is the Messiah. There's a prophecy in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. I see him, but not now. I see him, but not near. A star shall rise out of Jacob, and a shevet, a scepter, shall come out of Israel. Remember that Joab, that he took the shevet, the scepter, and that is what he pierced the heart of Avshalom with. So the scepter is a picture of the Messiah.